Hello, good evening, good morning, whatever time zone you're in. Welcome to this virtual event of the ICTS. I'm really delighted to have Professor John Wettlaufer giving us one of our very special ICTS distinguished lectures. The topic of his lecture is also something which I'm sure many of you are here because it was quite a game-changing decision of the Nobel Committee this year to award this prize in the area of complex systems, particularly climate. And there's no better person to sort of explain this to us than Professor Wettlaufer, who was on the committee. So we look forward to your talk. I just wanted to mention for those of you who are joining in for the first time, ICTS is a center of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. We are located in Bangalore. And in addition to our in-house research, we also have a large number of programs currently online, but hopefully in the near future back to in-person mode in a number of areas in theoretical physics, mathematical sciences, computational sciences, biological sciences. And climate has been one of the increasing focus areas, especially given our in-house researchers led by Professor Rama Govindarajan, whom you will hear next, who have been also exploring this direction, which is why we felt particularly excited by this year's choice of the Nobel Prize that I think will really help bring this subject to the center stage in physics. So I think the ICTS distinguished lectures, I should say, have been delivered by some extremely eminent scientists, and it's one of our very special lectures. Usually, of course, we have it in person, but we made a special exception in this particular case, given the very important and topical nature of the lecture we are about to hear. So with that, let me hand it over to Professor Rama Govindarajan, the Dean Academics at ICTS, who will introduce the speaker to us. Over to you, Rama.
Thanks, Rajesh. So I want to add to what Rajesh said, that we are absolutely delighted that Professor John Wettlaufer has agreed to be our distinguished lecturer today. Professor Wettlaufer is at Yale University as the A.T. Bateman Professor of Geophysics, Mathematics and Physics, and a Fellow of Silliman College. He is also Professor of Applied Math and Theoretical Physics at Nordic in Stockholm. He has a long association also with Oxford University as visiting professor, where he is the founder and co-director of the Mathematical Observatory. So John is extremely well known for his important and very original contributions to complex phenomena in different contexts and to climate change questions. So as a fluid mechanician, I've long known about his description of sea ice as a mushy layer, and then understanding its dynamics in a fundamental way, also in its response to climate change. So his contributions to convection in rotating flows are another example of his scholarship. He's done, research in very wide spectrum of topics. So in 2016, incidentally, he wrote an editorial in the Physical Review Letters titled Climate Science: An Invitation for Physicists. And this, I think, was prescient. So his standing as a chemical climate scientist and a statistical physicist and fluid dynamicist is recognized by his being elected a fellow of both the American Geophysical Union as well as the American Physical Society. And among his many recognitions, I'll also mention that he's a fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and has won the Royal Society of London Wolfson Research Merit Award. So, as you may have gathered from the abstract of today's talk, John was on the Nobel Committee for Physics this year. So, at ICTS, we've had, recent winners of the Nobel Prize give us lectures about their work, and this was really exciting. But I don't think we've had a member of the Nobel Prize committee speak to us about the science behind the Nobel Prize, and this is super exciting. So before I end, I have an announcement to make. Please, everyone who has a question, put your questions in the chat box, whether you're in Zoom or YouTube. And Professor Shamridhi Shankar Rai will be the moderator for today, and he will put your questions to Professor Wettlaufer. So with this, I welcome Professor John Wettlaufer to give his lecture. John.
Rama, thank you very much, and Rajesh, thank you very much for the invitation. Good morning from my side, and good evening to you all. And I do very much look forward to seeing you in person when the world returns to some sense of normalcy. So what my real goal is for today is to try to give you really the scientific background for the work that was done by this year's prize winners. A principal goal really is, if you read the abstract, is to try to draw in the young people who are thinking about problems to work on in the future. So the level of the science that I'm going to describe is geared towards a graduate student, and the experts are experts, and I'm not likely going to teach you something new, except for perhaps provide some perspective with respect to how these different areas have been fit into the umbrella of this year's prize. Okay, so it's really a scientific summary rather than a scientific seminar. Just for clarity, the process is an ongoing process, and you can see that nominations are being solicited now on this timeline. And the deadline for those who are asked to make nominations is in the end of the first month of next year. And if you're going to win a prize, you need to be nominated in that year. There is an enormous amount of work. I would say it's akin to sort of a full-time job, which is hard when you have other full-time jobs. From about that time period until the announcements are made. If you're interested in the detailed deliberations, there are long reports that are written each year. And 50 years from now, you can read the report if your Swedish is good for this year. So every 50 years, the deliberations are made or available to the public. So this year's committee has, each year there is a head of the committee, and it's Hans Hansen was this year. There's a standing secretary for the committee that serves a term, and Gunnar Ingemann is just completing that. And then the rest of the committee has various backgrounds in science, and they are Ulf Danielsson, David Haviland, Anders Gierbeck, Mats Larsson, Eva Olsen, and myself. So this year's winners fall under an umbrella of work in complex physical systems. And it's very clearly a split prize between Shukuro Manabe and Klaus Hasselmann on the one hand, and Giorgio Parisi on the other hand. their work, which I hope to explain in rather pedagogical terms, ranges from microscopic to global scales, and then actually back again. And my view is that it's the work of Hasselmann that is the glue between the work of Manabe and the work of Parisi. And I hope that becomes clear as we move on. So let me focus first on the work of Manabe and Hasselmann. And the reason is that for historical reasons, fields evolve and then they bifurcate and then they take a life of their own. And even these two gentlemen, Manabe and Hasselmann, they know each other, but they're also in different sub areas of their areas. This is the problem of what I would call the stovepiping of science. But the reason I say that is that in theoretical physics, in the area of physics, we don't teach climate science in most places, and it has taken on a life of its own and fits under the umbrella of earth and planetary sciences more than in physics, even though it's grounded in basic physical principles. So let me begin then with that part of the prize, which is for the physical modeling of Earth's climate, quantifying variability, which is essential, and reliably predicting global warming. And given that background, I would like to start with the history of the field. So a brief history of physical climatology. It dates to Fourier, whom we all know. You cannot be working in physics and not come to grips with the work that Fourier did, Fourier series, Fourier analysis, generalized harmonic analysis. In 1824, he wrote a paper which was incredibly insightful. And what he recognized is what we now think about in terms of this figure at the bottom here, that there's a spectral separation between the driving force, the energy coming from the sun in the visible, and the conversion of that energy by the material that is the Earth into outgoing infrared radiation. And he understood very clearly the visible part of the spectrum, the sun. And then he surmised that there must be some dark heat, dark energy. He called it dark heat. And I think that's probably the first dark energy of physical science, that invoking something invisible as essential for understanding the fact that the planet is rather warm, and that the atmosphere itself must be interacting with this dark heat. And that really is the greenhouse effect. However, he didn't quantify it. He was obsessed with really two things besides making this statement. If you read his paper, it's sort of a ethereal and semi-philosophical. He was obsessed with the energy input to the system from the interstellar medium, which we now know from Kobe is 2 degrees, but he thought it was much, much larger, and was really deluded by that assumption. The other thing that is key for us as physicists was that he was obsessed with the amount of energy stored in the upper layer of the solid Earth. That's where Fourier analysis came from, right? So if you have a time-varying boundary condition on a semi-infinite system, then you get a wave, and it was this that he was thinking about. He wanted to know the net amount of heat every year that was stored in the surface of the Earth. And so this study led to a whole bunch of very important ideas, beginning in 1824. So I would put the physics of climate starting really with Fourier. Tyndall, who was, if you don't know him, he was a typical polymath of his time. Some 40 years later, motivated by the work of Fourier and others, decided to make some incredible systematic experimental measurements of absorption and emission of infrared radiation, dark heat, in the laboratory. And he is credited with providing the experimental basis, the spectra, for the greenhouse effect. Now, this paper, I would encourage you to read. It is an experimental tour de force. He was so focused on making quantitative measurements that he invented a differential galvanometer, and he also could control reference temperatures in rather poor laboratory conditions. And it shows the lengths to which people should go through to make quantitative measurements. And so that really provided the spectra for moving forward. Langley was really an inventor focused on astronomy and instrumentation. He, with Frank Very, made the first infrared observations of the moon. And those are key in trying to make an effective model of how infrared radiation is absorbed and transmitted through the atmosphere. So Langley's measurements, he invented the bolometer, which is a very high precision technique for measuring temperature now. It's used in turbulent thermal convection and many other areas. And these measurements, along with those of Tyndall, were what came together in a tour de force paper in 1896, 70 years after Fourier, by Svante Arrhenius, who, as you may or may not know, was interested in electrolytes and other areas of then physical chemistry. He was focused on ice ages. His paper really sets the framework for all calculations of climate energy in the future. And so this down here, the first energy balance model, which I'll come back to, was constructed by him using these spectra and using a mathematical model. He made a calculation which is now sort of the litmus test or the benchmark which is used today. And he asked, if you doubled CO2, what happens to the surface temperature of the Earth? Why did he come up with doubling of CO2? That's still what people do. That came from his estimates of the coal stocks that were available on Earth. He said if you combusted these coal stocks, and then it would roughly double CO2, and therefore the consequences would be, he got a number of 5 degrees Celsius, which is very, very similar to the range found today, but there were 2 offsetting errors. The spectra were not quite good enough, and he also had an assumption about his model that offset that, and so his number was would have been overestimated in one sense and underestimated in another. But the framework is really the bookkeeping that is done today. So this is a major step in understanding the operation of planetary climate. Now, at this time, the words climate and weather, it wasn't clear how they were related. So the idea of computing the state of the climate really was not distinguishable or distinguished between computing the state of the weather. And as we now know, these are very different objects. And the first person to dig into it, we know from the turbulence, Louis Fry Richardson, and a number of other things. He was a Quaker, so therefore explicitly a pacifist, and was interested in the mathematical analysis of war, effectively a four-color problem, because he wanted to prevent war. But he was the first person to suggest that we could, in principle, compute the state of the weather. And this was in a book here published in 1922, Weather Prediction by Numerical Process. And so he envisioned the way you would do that is to have a large hall where you had people with sheets of paper computing the difference version of the PDEs and handing the solution around to the next person. And there would be some individual directing the whole process and computing the weather. Now he tried this in 1922, and he was attempting to reproduce a single 8-hour day in 1910, for which he had the data. It took him 6 weeks of calculations. He did this, of course, by hand. And he did this while driving an ambulance during World War I. I like to point this out to students who get tired of doing calculations. That's dedication, particularly since it was a huge failure. And the failure was the way in which he smoothed the initial data in order to make his calculations easier, right? So he was really effectively homogenizing over the nonlinearities. But the idea was there. In the intervening time, we had a computer revolution. And this was spearheaded by John von Neumann and Jules Charny. And von Neumann was, as many of you will know, working in everything from pure mathematics to applied mathematics. He was another Hungarian polymath. He was interested in scientific computing, and the best target beyond producing weapons, which is where he actually got the money to do the computations, was the weather. And he recruited Jules Charny to help in that effort. They reproduced a computer called the ENIAC, which was built at Penn, and which was an analog computer. But von Neumann invented the stored program computing architecture. And so what took the ENIAC 24 hours with stored programmed computing took 5 minutes. Okay. And that was a huge motivation for weather forecasting. And built around that was a growing group of people. So this was 1950, and using this and observations, it was Rossby, who you may know from geophysical fluid dynamics, built the real theory from the primitive equations and the Rossby waves, the jet stream, and so forth. He was a major figure in founding meteorology schools that were based on fundamental physics and incorporating observations. He combined these methods, what we would call now a hybrid method, to compute the weather 3 times a week for the Swedish Air Force. That's 4 years later. Let me jump ahead. Gilbert Plass was an expert in radiative transfer. And he was an expert in radiative transfer in part because of a worry about nuclear winter. And so he was toggling back and forth between 2 fields. And in 1956, a few years later, he identified key aspects of radiative transfer that are relevant to understanding climate. So he did line-by-line calculations of absorption and emission through the atmosphere, and identified pressure broadening and the height dependence of absorption due to the density change as you go up in the atmosphere, and concluded that there would be no saturation, which was the speculation of Ångström. There was a big fight between Arrhenius and Ångström about saturation of the effect of carbon dioxide. And he made a pretty woolly estimate of degree warming in 100 years. Of course, it matters what you assume happens in that 100 years. But that work was fundamental to the next major steps. And let me just give you a pedagogical view of the kinds of things he did, which you can do by going to David Archer's website at the University of Chicago, and you can compute. He has online models that you can go ahead and use to make all sorts of calculations. This is a way to think about the greenhouse effect from the radiative transport perspective. So these are black body curves at various temperatures, the smooth curves. And then along here, the wiggly curve is our atmosphere, okay? This would be the outgoing radiative flux that you would measure at the top of the atmosphere, okay? So you see the crucial role of water vapor. And on the left and over here on the right, this is wave number rather than wavelength or frequency. And then there's methane and ozone here. And then there's this bite associated with carbon dioxide, right? So the lack of outgoing long wave radiation in this range is due to the fact that it's being absorbed and re-emitted back to the surface. Okay, so you can calculate this. It's a Motran model that uses modern spectrum. Okay? And you can see what happens as you take an atmosphere with no carbon dioxide and you arbitrarily increase it here up to 1,000 ppm, and the bite of CO2 increases. So how do you do a study with this? If you have no CO2, you can compute the integral under the curve, which is 249 watts per square meter going out to space. Okay? And that's associated with a surface temperature of 270 Kelvin. Now, if you instantaneously put 1,000 ppm into the atmosphere, this bite occurs, and that there's associated decrease in outgoing long wave radiation flux, right? So what has to happen is that the system has to re-equilibrate, right? So there's an instantaneous decrease in outgoing long wave flux, and then it takes some time for the system to re-equilibrate. And that for that to happen, to reach the original outgoing flux, then the wings, the rest of the spectra has to go up. And in order for that to happen, the rebalanced surface temperature is 8.5 Kelvin warmer. So a huge increase, right? In order to re-equilibrate the system, if nothing else happens. So from this standpoint, the system is sensitive, right? 8.5 degrees is a big influence. So how do you put this into the larger scale context? Keeling has been measuring on Mauna Loa with analytical precision since 1957, the CO2 concentration. And you see it went over 400 ppm in 2015. So key is that it hasn't really been over 300 for the last 400,000 years. In fact, it hasn't been over 300 for the last 800,000 years. That information comes from extracting ice cores from the ice sheets, Antarctica and Greenland in this particular case, and looking at back in time. So from the standpoint of what was happened since the Industrial Revolution, this is why people are concerned about CO2. Okay, you can calculate the spectra, you can look in past climates, and it was in fact these ice ages that were what Arrhenius was interested in. So now, a decade after the von Neumann-Charny enterprise, it expanded. Joe Smagorinsky was recruited to Princeton, and the idea for climate models was just taking a weather model and running it for a long time, and computing the general circulation of the atmosphere. That was the goal. I put Cecil Leith in this box over here, because this group of people, led by Smagorinsky, were working in Princeton, and Cecil Leith, or Chuck Leith, was working by himself. He was someone who was at Lawrence Livermore, which you may know is principally, or was principally at the time, focused on the hydrogen bomb after Edward Teller. He must have done something very good for them, because they said, go away. And they allowed him to go to the National Center for Atmospheric Research and just study climate. And so he single-handedly wrote a code in, and computed the circulation of the atmosphere. And he was not there, though, studying climate. He was studying the large-scale circulation, but he wasn't interested in the same effects that I just described. But he did an amazing piece of work. Some of you who are interested in turbulence will know Bob Kreishnan. Leith and Kreishnan had a collaboration in the early work of Bob on turbulence. And so this group was building, and they wanted to improve these models by putting in more realistic boundary conditions. And then the two key things are some way to deal with convective heating and some way to deal with moisture. And so it's Shiguro Manabe and his collaborators, Weatherald and Strickler and others, who were focused on these issues, in addition to the radiative influence. I need to point out Mikhail Budico, who was really working on what are called energy balance theories. At about the same time, these are what I would call sort of theoretical physics views of the climate, taking Arrhenius's ideas and generalizing them in particularly clever ways. But he pointed out a key issue, which is called the ice albedo feedback. The visible reflectivity of the planet depends on the amount of ice cover. And so he found an instability where you could go from ice-free to ice-covered. And that's key to what we now understand as polar amplification under global warming. It came from his mathematical analyses. So what did the Princeton people do that Plass did not? Plass was doing line-by-line radiative calculations. So they dealt with two things: atmospheric thermodynamics and convective dynamics. So you know from undergraduate school about the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. He pointed out that relative humidity rather than absolute humidity is crucial. Why? Here's the saturation vapor curve, and for every 1 degree increase in the temperature of the atmosphere can hold 7% more water. Water is the most potent greenhouse gas. So if you know where the water is, you know the big part of the story you remember from the spectra that I've already showed. And so getting that correct is key to getting the net radiative budget of the planet correct. Secondly, and more in a more complicated process, is convection. So convection also has a very old history, beginning from Lord Rayleigh, who was interested in, if you have a layer of fluid that you heat from below, what's the critical temperature difference before the onset of motion? And then if you really increase the temperature difference, then turbulence occurs. And these are the major figures in this area. Willem-Baucus, Louis Howard, a mathematician at MIT, Bob Kreisnon, who I mentioned, who was the last postdoc of Einstein, and Ed Spiegel. They had different theories for what happens when you have very turbulent convection. The important thing about convection is that it will homogenize the temperature difference in the important part of the atmosphere. So just to show you, here's some simulations from Srikanth Topoladoti of turbulent convection. And I just want you to see that as the system becomes, reaches some quasi-steady state, that there is basically no temperature difference except for in these tiny boundary layers. So the role of convection in redistributing temperature is very hard to do in a numerical model of the climate. We can do this with direct numerical simulations in this geometry, but this was what was on the mind of the climate modelers at Princeton. So the idea was to combine processes, each well understood in some sense individually, but that combination of these complex processes has important consequences. And so here you see in the bottom 15 kilometers or so of the atmosphere, the dry adiabatic lapse rate, that is, if you don't include moisture, but if you do, then there's latent heat effect. So what's observed is about 6 degrees per kilometer. Now, if you were just in radiative equilibrium, then the lapse rate would be much steeper. And if you were in optimally turbulent convection, like I just showed you, then there would be no temperature gradients, right? So these two extremes have to be reconciled with the observations. And what they did numerically was simply to say, look, if I compute a temperature gradient that's this way, I need to adjust it, or if it's this way, I need to adjust it. And that's what they called convective adjustment. So numerically, they simply adjusted the model. Okay? And the consequence of this work are really the 3 papers that are recognized by Manabe and his collaborators. The first 2 are what I just described. And the last one really is the first general circulation model, which is consistent with the previous predictions. And they found the 2.3 degrees warming upon doubling of CO2. And that's still a moderate number. So the robustness of that number we could discuss, but it's pretty robust. And now let me go into the domain that is more within the area of theoretical physics, and quote Feynman, who, according to Gleek, believed in the primacy of doubt, not as a blemish on our ability to know, but rather as the essence of knowing. That is, that we have to know what we don't know, okay? All the calculations I've just described are deterministic calculations that put into the system something having to do with turbulence, but not in a way which leads to indeterminacy. And so the field in which we embrace this is statistical mechanics. We abandon certainty in some circumstances, like following each constituent in return for having it guaranteed in others. That is, that I can compute the pressure, for example. Okay. And in the context of what we're discussing, it really is turbulence and chaos that underlie uncertainty in flows. And they are simply not resolved in any numerical climate models, either then or today. And so just to remind us, in physical science, we measure something to within error. And putting errors on these predictions is key. So historically, it really is Poincaré who was focused on the long-term behavior of the three-body problem, who pointed out tangling of homoclinic orbits and what we would now call a positively operative exponent. And he pointed out sensitive dependence to initial conditions. But it was really Ed Lorenz that delivered us in this tour de force paper in 1963, at about the same time as the Princeton work, the idea of chaos. Okay. And this is a non-rigorous Galerkin, it's non-asymptotic Galerkin truncation of the full Oberbeck-Boussinesq equations for convection that Saltzman wrote down. But that doesn't really matter in terms of the fact that it produces this chaos. And it's easy now to compute, in fact, what he was looking at. If you slightly change some initial data, then the trajectory of a variable will diverge after a short period of time. So the sorts of questions that his work naturally led to are the orbits dense? Can orbits escape to infinity? How do they do that? How does stability fold into this picture? And so forth. And you could say, what do these things have to do with our practical problem of prediction? Well, pretty much everything. If you ignore this, then you're ignoring key issues in predictability. And embracing this uncertainty were Murray Mitchell and Klaus Hasselmann. Mitchell simply by fiat invoked a kind of Langevin equation for atmospheric forcing, and it was Hasselmann who made a real framework for it. And it was Hasselmann who argued that it was the chaotic dynamics of the weather which is the high frequency forcing for the climate. So in the end, there's an analogy with Brownian motion. So you have the climate, which is this white ball, and you have the weather, which are these tiny beads that are oscillating, that are being shaken at high frequency, right? And over long terms, they displace the climate. But key to, this standard way of thinking in Brownian motion is the way in which he laid out the problem. Okay, so the idea is that there's a dynamics for the weather and there's a dynamics for the climate, and that there's a small parameter which is the ratio of the intrinsic timescales of the former to the latter. And so there's a separation of timescales. Now, that's an ansatz, and that's an important ansatz for just thinking about the problem, and that's what he put forth. And then argued that there is a conditional averaging, that is, the state of the slow variable depends on the state of the fast variable. And at this first line of argument, then you could see there's a multiplicative term here. And so if you stop there, this is an important framework for stochastic climate theory. If you carry it a little further, then it looks like an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process. Okay. And further linearizing, it is an overdamped OU process, which has a power spectrum, which looks like this. You compute the autocorrelation, its power spectrum looks like this. And Hasselmann showed with Franquinho that the slow ocean climate integrates the stochastic contributions from the weather to produce this red noise forcing. So key is the starting point is a conceptual framework for thinking about stochastic parameterization. So his method can be directly connected to geophysical state variables. This deterministic averaging was actually rigorously justified in other areas before his work. Then in the recent past, there are proofs using limit theorems and numerical demonstrations that this works. And importantly, this framework underlies new stochastic parameterization schemes that don't assume clear separation of timescales. The red noise response is still a null hypothesis for analysis of variability in data. Now, he took it further and said, now having recognized that there has to be variability, can we distinguish signal from noise in the actual observations of the global state of the climate? And so he put out a space-time framework, which is really just a regression shown here where you have the observations, and then you take these climate models evolving and you do things deliberately to them. And you say, well, can you see this in the observations over natural variability in the climate system? And so it looks sort of like this. You have some observations, and then you do something with models X, and then you look for their fingerprints, or you change something about the models. Those are the fingerprints, and you look for them in the data. So here's an example with greenhouse gas forcing, other anthropogenic forcing, natural variability, and you see the observations here for all these models are explained by this fingerprint. And so in that way, he's looking at the climate problem as anyone in engineering looking for the signal from the noise. Okay. So you could use this framework to detect and attribute changes in climate to various physical features. Okay, now let me move after I just summarize the 4 papers that have been recognized by Hasselmann, all single author papers, 76, and then the first signal to noise treatment, 79, 93, and 97. Okay. I do want to point out that if you look in the 60s, the way in which this evolves from my interpretation is that Hasselmann was very interested in nonlinear wave interactions. So he's interested in waves on the surface of fluids, in particular ocean waves, which he looked at in the framework of Feynman diagrams. So if you look at the papers in the 60s, it's very clear he was trying to understand nonlinear effects and the separation of timescales. So let's move now to the second part of the prize given to Giorgio Parisi. And he really has worked on a range of problems that is just sort of stunning, that go from microscopic to planetary. And I just want to point out, Hasselmann invoked microscopic ideas to look at the macroscopic, okay? and Parisi has made many contributions at thinking about disorder and fluctuations, how they influence all sorts of physical systems. But in particular, his work on the framework of spin glasses has had a major impact on mostly problems that aren't spin glasses proper. Phil Anderson if you knew him, was not bashful. He said that the history of spin glasses may be the best example of the dictum that a real scientific mystery is worth pursuing to the ends of the earth for its own sake, independently of any obvious practical importance or intellectual glamour. So, of course, he started the field, but he's probably right in terms of practical influence. For those of you who don't know, a spin glass is really a dilute alloy of magnetic ions. So imagine dissolving some iron into gold and asking what the influence on the macroscopic properties are of the distribution of these ions. The problem with the field or the description is that the energetic landscape is not simple. It has an enormous number of very nearly equal energy states. The relaxation dynamics is very, very slow. So you could think of an actual normal glass, right, which you melt some sand, right, make a liquid out of it, and then quench it. And it lives forever in a metastable state, right? It doesn't revert back to its original state. There's the key lack of ergodicity. There are very large energy barriers between very nearly equal energy states. And so systems that experience such landscapes are what we call frustrated. So let me just give you a very brief summary. Okay. The key part of the Hamiltonian is shown here, where the coupling are uncorrelated Gaussian random variables with zero mean and some variance. Okay, so the idea of if you think about them in terms of spins, is that they are randomly correlated spins, and then the range of the interactions depends, of course, on the structure of the theory. And the first theory is put forth by Edwards and Anderson in 1975, where the interactions were short-ranged. Okay. So the Edwards-Anderson model is the basis for the starting point of spin glass theory. Very soon after, Sherrington and Kirkpatrick made an infinite model. It's a very long-range interactions. But of course, we know, the world is not infinite. When trying to compute this, the solutions to their model, interestingly, but not surprisingly, there was no convergence, or a very weak convergence. And in consequence of that, a great result is that the idea of simulated annealing was invented by Kirkpatrick in trying to compute the solutions to their model, which had a problem, and that is, as the temperature got lower, there became a negative entropy, which is illegal. And it was Thouless, Anderson, and Palmer who resolved this negative entropy catastrophes, as it was called, and focused on the uniqueness problem, or pointed out the uniqueness problem, which has to do with the stability of solutions. Okay. Now, using the idea of making copies of the system, which was Edwards' idea, one can make many replicas of the system, and it was De Alameda and Thouless that pointed out that there must be a symmetry breaking of this replica description, which is useful to compute the energy of the system. And the consequence of that was that not all pairs of copies gave the same average correlation. And this order parameter, which is shown here, was reflecting this idea. Now, nearly instantaneously, this is 78, Giorgio Parisi produced an order parameter that is self-consistent and provided a stable solution that also breaks replica symmetry. Okay, and it's this idea which is so important. So let me just explain the results in words. At any temperature below the critical temperature, he found there's no unique locally stable thermodynamic state. Rather, there are many, many such states, and each replica corresponds to a different solution of the mean field equations. And those solutions are clusters of states, replicas, in an n-dimensional configuration space of n spins, okay? N is a large number. So think about that energy landscape. Now, you can view this in a kind of genealogical tree, where the colors are the spin glass states of the system. So you can think about how far down in the tree you have to go to find a common ancestor. And then compute the overlap. The overlap between any pair of states of the same color, we'll call it Q1. Now, if you ask the overlap between the red over there on the left and the orange, or between the blue and the green, well, that's less than the overlap of the same color. And then the overlap of any 5 on the left and any 4 on the right is less again. But the amazing thing about this is that if you pick any 3 states at random, at least 2 of the overlaps are equal. And this observation is called ultrametricity. And that's what's exhibited by the Parisi order parameter. And so then if you look at the distribution of the order parameter, it looks like this, where the W's are just Boltzmann weights. And so a first order replica symmetry breaking will just give you this 2-state observation. So Parisi published these papers, and again, in pretty quick succession. 79, 2 in 1979, another in 1980, and then another in 1983. And then a wonderful summary book with his collaborators in short succession. Now, let me just point out an unexpected and recent observation of replica symmetry breaking in random lasers. Have nothing to do with spin glasses per se. The first experiments coming out of the Conti group in 2015. So there are a lot of ways to create a random laser, and these papers are all observing replica symmetry breaking in different variants of random lasers. And what I just want to point out from the Conti et al. Work is that you could think of the individual shots of the lasers as individual copies of the same system, and the energy is the inverse temperature. So so as the energy increases, the temperature decreases. And here, the top figure from their papers, intensity is a function of wavelength, which narrows. If you compute then from the data, mean intensity as a function of energy, and look at its variance, then there's a first order transition as the energy reaches a particular value. And taking that data and looking at each emission spectrum as a copy as I described, then you could look at the intensity fluctuation and construct the Parisi overlap order parameter, and therefore the distribution of that. And you see as the energy increases, or in analogy with the spin glass directly, as the temperature decreases, there is a first order replica symmetry breaking where you get these two peaks below from a single peak above at a particular energy. So this is a beautiful example of how this framework has had legs in other areas far beyond the original intent. And shown here by another group, Sarkar et al., the same effect, different random laser. Now let me just gingerly go through a few other areas where the Parisi framework has had an influence. One where he's actively working is having to do with hard spheres and the idea of jamming, and where the exponents seem to be valid from all the way from infinity down to 2 dimensions. There are active experimental tests of the ideas put forth in jamming, and the framework provided by the Parisi interpretation is driving further experimental work in this area. I just want to point out a couple of other areas which are important in connecting back to stochastic ideas. And this is an early paper which was required reading for me in graduate school, which is called Perturbation Theory Without Gauge Fixing, here in 1981, where there is, again, a stochastic differential equation, but here for a field. And it's pointed out, if you interpret the distribution of initial data, the long time evolution allows one to determine some equilibrium correlation function without appeal to gauge fixing. And then related to climate, there's beautiful papers by Benzi, Parisi, Alfonso Sutera, Angelo Volpiani, a sequence of wonderful papers on what's called stochastic resonance. Alfonso Sutera has since passed away. This work was the first paper that was submitted, not the first one accepted, on stochastic resonance, was interested in looking at climate change, the ice ages. So I want to say that is the motivation of this paper. But stochastic resonance, if you look at it, has influenced an enormous range of fields. I couldn't even name them all. So here's an area where trying to understand climate has influenced a whole bunch of other areas of physical sciences. A beautiful example. And so I just want to conclude that I think the umbrella of the work done here is nicely encapsulated by Charles Frank's comment upon the occasion of his retirement, that physics is not just concerning the nature of things, but concerning the interconnectedness of all the natures of things. And so on the one hand, you have building of deterministic climate models, which are knitting together various complicated things to make something that has a predictive aspect. And on the other hand, you have embracing the complexity of something and its disorder at a fundamental level to make predictions. And then there is everything in between. And I think that this is really what one might interpret as the overarching theme of this year's prize. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wettlaufer. This is Samriddhi for this fantastic sort of talk covering all the aspects connected with this year's Nobel Prize. So, we would have a few questions, if that's all right with you. And
certainly,
yeah, and y'all can either type it in the chat box or on YouTube, or just raise your hand. But Rama already sent in a question, so maybe we can begin with Rama. If you could unmute yourself and ask.
Okay, sure. So thanks, John. That was really brilliant. So I had maybe I'm not understanding clearly, but I had basic questions about both Manabe's finding and Hasselmann's. So in Manabe's case, were you saying that by adjusting the lapse rate to the observed, moist one, he could actually get the correct answer for temperature rise in his model? Is that what you were saying was the basic finding?
right. So if you go back to Arrhenius, okay, so Arrhenius has a layer of the atmosphere which is at one temperature, okay, and of course that's not going to get things right, because what happens is that where the planet is radiating in equilibrium to space is actually high in the atmosphere.
Right.
Okay, so it's up in the atmosphere, and it's colder up there.
Right.
So if you get that temperature wrong, you're going to get the wrong answer. And in fact, even if you put the right spectra into, an isothermal model, you'll get a wrong answer, because it's that place where the Earth is radiating back to space. So how do you get that correct? And that's key. And the two ingredients to get that correct are this convective adjustment. But so imagine that you got the convective adjustment simply empirically, right? You had the observations, but you had the spectra wrong, right? Then you're going to get the wrong answer. Okay. What's the key part of the spectra is the water vapor. Okay. And so the two really key advances are the convective adjustment, right, and getting to the idea that that what matters is the relative humidity. You might think that's trivial, but in fact it's not trivial, because if you really wanted to know where all the water was, then you should be able to compute the absolute humidity, right? Where is all the water in the atmosphere? What's the dynamics? And therefore now, but as you can imagine, that's really hard to do. And if we think about Claus's clapeyron, right, that the first and second laws of thermodynamics tell me I should be slaved to coexistence, and relative humidity is the thing to do that, right? Now, this is my interpretation. These are my words. It's not exactly what they say in the paper, but these are the consequences. So though, if you get those two things wrong, you'll not get the right warming effect.
Got it. Yeah. So if I may, a question about Hasselmann. So you explained very nicely how this, slow variable can be affected by, fluctuations, rapid fluctuations. Can you tell a little more how you can use this exactly to distinguish man-made from natural, which you showed in the next slide?
Okay, so I went too quickly. So in the 1976 paper, it's a theory, right? And if you take it to its end conclusion, then it's really just Brownian motion. Okay, then you say the consequence of that is the power spectrum is red, and you observe that, and that's the present day null hypothesis for climate data. Even though we don't think that there's a clear separation of timescales. So that's a theory, but the idea sets the framework for other stochastic theories. And that's an active area of research. The second thing is different. Okay, so the second thing is, okay, now I've recognized I mean, I don't want to speak for Hasselmann per se, but this is my interpretation. But now I've recognized that I really can't explain the climate variables if I ignore noise. Okay, so then let's look at the observations, and we'll use a climate model to produce a signal, a particular signal. I could tune it, I can put in greenhouse gas forcing, I could put in volcanic effects and so forth. And I know that there's variability there. And now let me do an experiment. You know, I have the observations. Let me change the model this way and see if it's consistent with the signal modulo the noise. Independently, of course, you run the models and look for their noise also. And the idea is basically that. And so I think that the stochastic model is led to the thinking of looking for a signal in the noise. And so they're really separate, but related in this conceptual sense.
Thanks.
Yeah.
There's a question related to what Rama, you were asking from Srikant Shastri. So Srikant, if you are able, would you like to unmute yourself and ask? Oh.
Maybe you could. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's now working. Yeah, I was about to ask on behalf of Srikant. Srikant, I think we can hear you now.
Thank you. Yeah, no, about Hasselmann's work. Of course, you know, this sort of separation of fast and slow sort of degrees of freedom is okay, but that doesn't automatically tell you about the nature of the noise. And what was assumed by Hasselmann and what do people think now is the reasonable thing to do? Because obviously a thermal bath for a Brownian particle is not the same thing as the chaotic weather.
Right. Okay. So you'll excuse me, I'm going to give you a somewhat long answer. I can tell you what he did, right? So in my description, there was the stopping point before the end result, which looked like an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, right? That stopping point on the conditional averaging still had the noise having a multiplicative structure, okay? So, right, the vanilla end result is that you have additive Gaussian white noise, and the consequence of that is this power spectra that is red. So fine, and that is a starting point, but we don't believe that there's a clear separation of timescales, right? That you know, if you look at data, the data will tell you that it's multifractal, right? And so if I think about a multifractal set of observations, you whatever they are, then there's a different dynamics for different times. Okay, and there may be a clear separation, there may not. That might depend on the data. From a theoretical standpoint, you know, that entire approach, where in the end you have an overdamped OU process, forgetting the noise, is in some sense problematic because we really know that the deterministic backbone for these systems is non-autonomous. Okay, so if you think about the study of the stability properties of deterministic autonomous linear or nonlinear ODEs relative to the non-autonomous case, you know, non-autonomous work is, you know, a set of measure zero relative to the autonomous work. So, these systems are forced in reality. That doesn't even yet get to the noise, okay? So one observes, depending on the time scale, there might be 1/f noise. The noise can be multiplicative. You can see multiplicative effects if you have, coupled systems that have a clear separation of timescales, but the nature of the coupling leads to a blurring of one to the other. So, I'm sorry it's a long answer, but my own view in my own work is that the starting point is nonlinear, non-autonomous, stochastic differential equations, where the noise structure has to be studied by starting with the observations. So I'm saying that the Hasselbalch approach was the approach that started people thinking about these things, and is consistent with some observations.
Thank you, John. There's another question from Mahendra Verma, who has raised his hand. Mahendra?
Yeah, hello, John. It's an excellent talk. Thanks. So my question is regarding predictability. The seasons repeat every year, no? I mean, this winter, summer come on different times. Is it because, well, it may be connected with cancelling of weather in climate. So large-scale Fourier modes or large-scale modes, maybe are the dominant factors, like Lorentz took three large-scale Fourier modes. So is it the reason why, well, I don't really follow the Hasselbalch work, but is it that large-scale Fourier modes are more important and they cancel out the fluctuations at small scale, which may be the reason why climate is somewhat deterministic? That's my question, if you got my question right.
Yeah, I totally understand your question. And my answer is actually not unrelated to the question of Shrikant Sastry and my answer to him. So let me just first say, it depends on the time scale you're looking at. And so the answer is yes, as long as you're marching effectively, you are filtering the high frequency response. However, there are large scale climate modes like El Nino, right? And the Indian Ocean dipole. Those are climate modes that have a predictability that is compromised on seasonal timescales, okay? And the reason for that, and now this is my own, work, is that if you think about a stochastic process in which the deterministic backbone has an effect whose magnitude and sign may change as a function of season, okay, then it's going to amplify or suppress the stochastic effects depending on time. And so there are things called predictability barriers. And so there's the El Nino predictability barrier, and there is, for example, Arctic sea ice, which the predictability of the minimum is compromised. That has to do with the same, I think, same basic physical effect. And that is on seasonal timescales, something changes. The sun comes up, the sun goes down in the Arctic, and the ice albedo feedback changes, or the long wave stabilization changes. And that means that the effect of noise is enhanced or suppressed, and therefore your predictability is compromised. However, the large scale modes are going to filter those out depending on what you're talking about, right? So there is an annual time scale. We always have winter, we always have summer, but then there are higher order modes in that whose predictability is compromised. So it's both the stochastic effect and it's a filtering effect.
Thank you, John. While we wait for other questions, John, could I ask you a question which is sort of more speculative? And this is, partly what you spoke about, and partly also your own interest. Rama did mention your editorial some years ago, which all of us had, some of us had read with great interest. So where do you stand now on some of the questions you had raised 5 years ago, in terms of the multi-scale nature of the problem? And there was this contrast that I know it could be a long answer, but in short, you had laid out the parameters between data analysis on one hand, theoretical physics modeling on the other, computational simulations for a really multi-scale problem. So it would be nice to hear your perspective since we have you here.
Thank you for that question. So I am, of course, I'm biased, as we all are, and from a historical standpoint, I give you an answer, right? So, and that's partly what was in the presentation, is that you had this evolution from computing the weather to computing the climate. Okay, now we have many major centers, I say 20. All of them have huge climate models, right? With many people putting in new parameterizations and updating legacy code and so forth. These are enterprises of sort of like government institutions, even though it's getting more simple, right? There's very big centers of climate modeling. Those approaches, evolved as computing became very, very easy, right? And now on our laptops, we can do all sorts of things that we just couldn't have conceived of doing just 10 years ago. So all of this, but what that has done is create a community of people who run climate models, right, and think about climate models. That is their tool, and that's great. And we need those for all sorts of reasons. However, in the process, the kind of work that Hasselmann did in his 76 paper sort of became forgotten, right? Because why should you use a simple model when you could compute the weather in Pittsburgh, in December 5 years from now? And so there is two views, one of let's call it practical realism, and the other is simple models. So as a general approach, there are these two approaches, and mine is the latter. However, we now also have developed an enormous number of interesting fundamental mathematical tools to look at data, and that's new. So whereas the computer revolution has pushed climate modeling into a large-scale enterprise, there are papers that people write that they've never run the model, they just compare the data in standard ways. We have, for lack of a better term, big data. We have all of this evolution of new methods for looking at data. And I think that's new, and I think that's a very important area to think about in looking at climate data over many timescales, and using it for our understanding of simple models. So my own interest, my own specific interest, is really focused in a, I guess, esoteric area of studying the Fokker-Planck equations for various simple models, right? We all know that there's a duality between the Fokker-Planck equation and the Langevin equation. You give me one, I'll give you the other one. And because the Fokker-Planck equation is a PDE, people would rather study the Langevin equation numerically or typically numerically. Whereas the Fokker-Planck equation is of big interest in, in core statistical physics, but we also have developed new methods from applied mathematics to look at solutions that get analytical solutions that are of direct relevance to studying climate problems and other problems. So I think there's a lot of room for people with our background to make contributions. And part of it is in looking at data analysis, looking at data in non-standard ways. Why do we have to do that? Because there are huge problems. The data are on anywhere from a day, right, to thousands of years in time. So how do you, if you want to look at a long-term effect, paleoclimate, ice ages, how do you use the data in an appropriate way that's faithful to the data? That's not necessarily a trivial problem, right? But it involves mathematics that is being brought to bear on a huge scope of other problems that have nothing to do with climate. And then there is looking at model systems, because model systems allow us to say big things, right? I mean, without caveats, the caveats are about the model. It's simple. On the other hand, it tells you the key issues. And I think that that we are now to a point where there's hopefully a kind of renaissance, that people will get interested in this and they will bring their simple tools to bear on these complex problems in a way which is a little more faithful to the observations that has been done in the past.
I thanks a lot. We need to wind up soon, but if there are any other quick questions that we can take, let me also check the YouTube channel if there's anything which is irrelevant. If not, then
I just see there is a question that asks about celestial events influencing climate. It says have an effect on Earth's climate and temperature.
If you want to take that?
Yeah, I will just say, well, that covers a lot of area. I can't really. I'll just say that things like volcanic events are actually modeled for example, in the Hasselmann approach, they put in volcanoes. We know from, say, Pinatubo, that a volcanic event influences climate over the years of time because it blocks incoming solar radiation, right? That was the problem with nuclear winter, and that's also believed to be what killed most of the dinosaurs in the Cretaceous Tertiary event, because there was the aerosols lofted into high the atmosphere. They have a long resonance time, and that blocks incoming radiation, and therefore influences climate. So volcanoes are one thing. There's something called global dimming, which has to do with the aerosols that we put into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels, and particular dirty sources of energy that we've been doing. That also has the same effect. And there's a worry that, of course, when we stop polluting, there will be transient warming in the system. And that also is sort of interesting. And I would also encourage people to think about those problems in terms of simple mathematical models.
Thank you. So I guess, thanks a lot again. John, for giving us your time. I'll join Rama and Rajesh in sort of thanking you for being able to do this, and we look forward to sort of seeing you in Bangalore, hopefully in the not so distant future. And
thank you very much, Shankar, Rajesh, and Rama. Thank you for your questions from the audience. And I'll just point you to, there's a document called Scientific Background on the Nobel site that covers a lot of this kind of stuff. It's at this level, but there's more detail and more references in the event that you're interested in some of these issues. And I appreciate your general interest, and I hope to see you in India.
Thank you very much for a very illuminating talk. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rama. Bye now.
Bye.